Another guilty plea in a widening corruption investigation. The state halts efforts for now to renew its supply of lethal injection drugs. Approval of emergency rules could speed implementation of medicinal marijuana, and Republicans in Arkansas are coming together this weekend as their president backpedals. Arkansas Week is just ahead.
Local broadcast of Arkansas Week is made possible in part by the award-winning Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, Arkansas's largest major newspaper, bringing you local, national, and international news since 1819. By the Arkansas Times, keeping you informed by covering people, events, and politics in Arkansas. By FM 89, KUAR in Little Rock, with in-depth news reporting, analysis, and discussion each weekday.
And welcome to Arkansas Week. I'm Michael Heblin, News Director of KUAR Public Radio in Little Rock. I'll be sitting in for Steve Barnes this week. A busy week indeed, a lot to talk about. Let's get to it. Joining me on the panel is Dr. Kim Maslin, Professor of Politics at Hendrix College. Hoyt Purvis is Professor Emeritus of Journalism from the University of Arkansas and a columnist. And Wes Brown is a reporter for Talk Business and Politics. And Kim, wow, what a week. Obviously what's dominated the news nationally and internationally this week has been Trump and the encounter with Russian President Vladimir Putin. This comes at a time when the Republican Party of Arkansas is holding its annual convention this weekend. And I know the party always likes to put on a unified front, but there's got to be a lot of backroom discussions going on there in terms of how to address this. First off, your takeaway as you've seen what's happened this week.
So the timing of this is interesting on a number of fronts as it sort of connects in with the Republican meeting, as it connects in with the Supreme Court nominee, and then as you saw the indictments actually play into the meeting. So the timing of this is really fascinating. I think one of the things to think about when you think about this meeting is that one of Trump's goals is clearly to normalize relations with Russia, by which I think he means increase the use of diplomatic means as a way to resolve disputes and tensions. Given that goal, what are the things you might expect to see at a meeting like this? Certainly you'd expect to see a discussion of what are the barriers to normalizing of relations, as well as what are the benefits. If we're going to normalize relations, what are some of the topics that we can expect to take on, that we can expect to address? So I think what we would expect is that under barriers, certainly there would be a discussion of intervention in the 2016 election, annexation of the Crimea, the use of nerve agents inside the UK, right? So I think one of the things that we would expect to see is here are some of the barriers to normalizing relationships, and then if we can do that, where does that take us in terms of the issues that we might like to take on in the context of these diplomatic relationships? Typically, at a meeting like this, it would be the responsibility of the delegation to sort of push forward the American agenda on both of those fronts. And so that's the context in which what transpired was deeply troubling, not just to the Democrats, but to both parties pretty much universally, right? So what you'd expect is that the American president would say to the Russian president, if we're going to normalize relations, here are some of the things that we need to see movement on. That's where extradition of the individuals under indictment comes up, right? And so instead of pushing that agenda forward, what you get is Putin saying, okay, if that's what you want, just send us a formal request and we'll interview these people. Now, how he walks that back then is really interesting. No, actually, we'll do one better. We'll allow you to be present while we interview these people, but if we're going to grant that concession, then we expect to be able to interview Americans whom we suspect of engaging in illegal activities. And Trump's response is, what an incredible offer, right? And that's where you start to get the blowback from both parties.
I think what it looks like, when you look at all the optics of this, what it looks like, it's not only about President Trump, it's about America. It makes America look weak because it gave deference to Vladimir Putin. As she said, when you go into these diplomatic meetings, you have an agenda. It's interesting, we're here talking about, but nobody actually knows what was said during those meetings. We can't, how do we know if the American agenda was pushed forward? There are incredible issues that we face right now in terms of our relationships, international issues. She mentioned the Crimea situation, all the murders that have taken place in relationship in England and other places because of Vladimir Putin. We forget that he's a former KGB agent. In addition to that, America has a lot of issues on the forefront that were not discussed, that were not put forward. So this, he gave deference to Vladimir Putin, made him, actually it's kind of, in some situations actually elevated his stature on the international level. Now, who is the American president is supposed to be the most powerful person in international politics. I don't think that we can say that now.
Well, the question of what went on during these discussions, and talk now of maybe bringing the interpreter to testify, behind closed doors to Congress. But Hoyt, a lot of disappointment.
I wanted to say something about the interpreters as well, but let's back up just a little bit and talk more about Trump and his modus operandi, his way of doing things. If you look back over the past couple of years, you'll see a pattern where Trump, when an issue gets very controversial, things get stirred up, he has a remarkable knack for serial subject changing. He moves on to something else. And I think we've seen him attempt to do that in this case, most recently by apparently inviting Putin to come for a visit this fall. But I think it's also interesting to look at the reaction, and particularly the role or the non-role of the Congress. And it's interesting, in the Arkansas delegation all pretty much in one way or another expressed some, at least indirect, criticism of Trump about the outcome of the meeting in Helsinki and what came after that. But in this particular case that we're talking about now, it was interesting to see, for example, Senator Bozeman said, Russia is not our friend. He expressed confidence in the intelligence community. It was interesting to see Senator Cotton because in some respects the statement he issued was very much along the talking points that came out of the White House after a couple of days. Now, Cotton certainly had some things to say about the meeting itself, but he picked up the Trump claim that I'm tougher on Russia than anybody else, and that, and one of the things he mentioned, Senator Cotton mentioned, was the issue of sanctions, and saying that this was something that under the Trump administration we had ever tougher sanctions. But in fact, if you'll remember, Trump himself was not in favor of strengthening those sanctions, and although it did eventually get congressional approval and his signature, he did so reluctantly. Now, while I've got the floor, I'll say one more thing about Senator Cotton, which is interesting to see. As anybody who's followed these things knows well, he's had a particular concern about Iran. That's something that he's felt very strongly about. And so most recently, he's introduced legislation that would impose sanctions on some Iranian officials in return for the fact that Iran holds some some Americans and others, as at least in his view, in Cotton's view, that these are being, in effect, they're hostages. So it's interesting to see how, and finally on all this, I would just say that what you seem to have seen the first couple of days after Monday seems like a long time ago now, but after that, it seemed that more, not just Democrats, but more Republicans were beginning to express themselves on this. But then in the last day or two, I think it seems like they're kind of easing away from that, and we're not hearing as much in the nature of critical comments about Trump's actions.
Because the reaction was very swift, especially in terms of the questioning of intelligence. You had First District Congressman Rick Crawford, who sits on the House Intelligence Committee, saying that, no, this is solid information that Russia interfered with our election. And this is these are people who normally don't question Trump, who have through a whole lot of stuff this year and last have stood by their party's commander-in-chief.
In the meantime, our intelligence community has been thrown under the bus. Our allies, we forget that the week ahead of this Helsinki meeting, that our Trump came out, strongly criticized NATO, strongly criticized our best allies, Germany, the Brexit situation in England.
And the EU generally.
Yeah, generally. So to see this happen, and I mean, this is a sea change in terms of international politics and how we approach these major issues that are affecting global policy, the political landscape, and it's, unless there's something that comes out of this that puts the American general and states that America strongly, we will protect our elections. One, we will stand with our allies, and lastly, we will fight tyranny. Those are three things that we are forgetting, and if we lose those things, we lose ourselves as a nation.
Kim, some Trump responders have essentially said, so what? There is a certain degree of his supporters who just say, well, I'm glad Russia, I've even seen it said on social media, I'm glad if Russia helped Trump beat Hillary Clinton. Why is this important?
Well, so cybersecurity is not going away as an issue, right? And so I think the first response to why is this actually a big issue is Trump's responsibility as president is to lead an American response. And so if the American response is, it's okay, we don't think you actually did anything wrong, then first, the American response is either chaotic or at the very best, it lacks focus. Two, it's a signal to not only Russia, but anybody who might want to hack into any kind of database in the US, that there is nothing to worry about if this is your agenda item, right? And cybersecurity, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, is something you should be desperately concerned about, because it isn't just about winning elections, though that's a big part of it. It also has to do with our entire grid, right? Where do you think the power systems are controlled, right? So there's a whole lot of facets of life that become at risk if we let cybersecurity fall off the agenda of issues that we have got to be concerned about. I think the other thing that was interesting to me out of that press conference is there's a moment when the question that's posed basically to Putin is, why should the American people or President Trump believe you when you say you didn't interfere in this election, and yet there is all this evidence? And his response to that, at least part of his response to that, which I thought was so fascinating, was, this is not about trust. He doesn't trust me. I don't trust him. He acts in the best interest of the United States. I act in the best interest of the Russian Federation. Right? So there's a really interesting question then. If what you want to do is normalize relations, diplomatic relations, how do you proceed with that if the person that you're sitting across the table from has told you you can't trust him?
Well, before we move on from this topic, it's been a little more than a week since we had the Trump announce his nominee for the U.S. Supreme Court, Brett Kavanaugh. What role could he play in this?
So I think when you look at the Kavanaugh nomination, there's three big issues that are going to be interesting that I expect to see come up, right? And the one that connects up most nicely with the rest of what's been happening this week is the issue of investigating presidential wrongdoing. So Hal Bass was on this show last week, and he pointed out that Kavanaugh was part of the Kenneth Starr investigation into Bill Clinton. Specifically, he was responsible for the inquiry into Vince Foster's suicide and the Clinton-Lewinsky affair. He has since suggested that presidents should have absolute discretion in whether and when to appoint an independent investigator. So effectively what this means is that presidents could be subject to impeachment, but short of that, investigations into presidential wrongdoing could only happen with the president's approval. And Hal suggested that we should expect to see some questions on this during his nomination. How do you explain this change of heart?
I think we're definitely going to see some questions about that.
We're definitely going no doubt about that. But I don't want to take you away from that, but just to say, ultimately, is it going to affect the outcome of the vote whenever it may occur in the Senate?
So at least Trump's performance this week has certainly set us up to be sensitive to questions of presidential wrongdoing.
Okay, we've got to move on. Wes, ever-widening corruption investigation. We had another guilty plea Thursday. The head of a nonprofit that helped at-risk youth pleaded guilty to steering money to lawmakers in return for state funding, a pattern we've seen over and over.
Yeah, and I guess the thing that threats these things altogether is a preferred family health care lobbyist, well-known lobbyist in Arkansas, Milton Cranford, who is under indictment. He was the person who put this scheme together. It's Youth Arkansas, I think South Arkansas Youth Services in Magnolia. Basically, it's the same scheme. You funnel nonprofit money that have been given to you from the state back to senators or influential people. That money was funneled, and if you look at the indictment, as in the past indictments, there are Arkansas politicians, unnamed Arkansas politicians in the indictment. There's if you look at the indictment, there's a state senator that's been identified so far in this widening ongoing investigation, which has touched every federal district in Arkansas and one in Missouri. There has been, I think, to date, 7 Arkansas lawmakers who have been named or indicted or had plea agreements. So in every time one of these come out, you can go up to the state capitol and you hear whispers. You hear people talking about what's the next shoe to drop, who else is this going to affect. As we know, the governor's nephew has been mentioned in one of these. He hasn't been indicted. There hasn't been anything to come out of that, but it still brings questions, especially as you go into the 2019 regular session. It's going to make things uneasy. It's going to bring in a lot of questions about how do we change the dynamic, and how can Arkansans trust the politicians to do the right thing. And
I believe you're definitely right when suggesting that there are maybe more shoes to drop in this and more names to emerge. And I don't know if this is the right time to interject it, but we've also got this case of a legislator who doesn't pay his taxes like most of the rest of us do, presumably. And despite a lot of commentary and pressure, at least as far as I know, he's still refusing to step down.
Yeah, and the governor coming out very strongly saying he should step down, he should drop his re-election bid. So we'll probably see more on that. On the topic of executions, we this week learned that the Department of Correction has halted its effort to seek new lethal injection drugs as it comes to they realized essentially that a 2015 law that was designed to protect the sources of these lethal injection drugs, the 3 drugs used by the state, it needs to be modified to now protect manufacturers. So we had the supply of one of the lethal injection drugs expire in March, and the Department of Correction not looking for more at this point, and executions essentially on hold at this point.
Yeah, that drug, I think it was veronium bromide, expires in March, and you know, the thing about this is that these drug companies who make these drugs, they don't mind selling them because they profit from the sale of these. But if their name is going to be put in the public, or sometimes they have to, especially with the Securities and Exchange Commission, they have to make a statement to say we manufacture these drugs. And what we've seen in the past is that shareholders have gotten the game and come forward and said, we don't want you, we don't want to be associated with a drug company that kills people, that sells drugs to these states, and to provide lethal injection drugs for these states. So I think you're going to see similar issues. Arkansas is not the only one facing this. Florida, I think, and Oklahoma has also postponed its execution. So this is an issue that's going to be ongoing, because if you look at the list of people on the execution list in Arkansas, it's a long list. And at some point, I think state lawmakers are going to say, how can we get this back on schedule, because that's the era that we're in right now.
Yeah. Well, being behind schedule is medical marijuana.
Yeah.
We had a rule change approved by a subcommittee of the Legislative Council this week to speed up the process of scoring the applications for companies that want to become retail dispensaries. And Wes, this obviously comes after big legal conundrum about the grower licenses.
Yeah, the Supreme Court essentially threw it back in the hands of the Arkansas Medical Commission to get the Arkansas medical marijuana industry back on schedule. You know, in November 2016, Arkansas voters to legalize the use of medical marijuana, and since then, all the applications for dispensaries and pot greenhouses came in September. In February, the cultivation centers were approved, and we got into this legal wranglings of this. And now the dispensaries, which are actually where you can go into a shop and buy medical cannabis products, I think the commission, who has been harangued about this, don't want to take this on. So what we had now, they're going to go out and bid and hire probably a national consultant to come in and score these, and it's probably going to take toward the end of the year before we get this back on schedule. And then I think one state official told me that even if we get seed in the ground in January, it won't be until mid-2019 before we see the medical marijuana industry get back on schedule, notwithstanding maybe some future lawsuits again.
It is interesting that after all this, that we're turning to a consultant now. I mean, that's what you do when you've tried everything else, and you bring in a consultant. And I'm not trying to make light of the complexity, because it has proven to be a very complex process, but we certainly haven't heard the last of it yet.
Yeah, and members of the Medical Marijuana Commission had been scoring the applications individually for the growing licenses, and said that was taking too long. And then you had the appearance of impropriety, and one commission member saying that they were approached essentially for a bribe.
Right. Yeah, and there are 203 of these dispensary applications, and if you understand the process, some of these applications are hundreds of pages long to go in and to look at it. And these people are, some of them, I think 3 of them are doctors. They do this part-time, and to actually, if they would have to go through it, and then they face all these accusations that they were being bribed, that some of the applications were fraudulent. I think they just want to get it off their plate. I think a big note is that it's been in November, it will be 2 years since Arkansas voters voted for this, and there are people, I guess the people in the industry are saying, people need this right now, and I think that's the overwhelming question that people are saying. And was the laws written to basically thwart the will of the Arkansas voters?
And finally, there was also one other change on Thursday, a rule to keep the applications on file for growers in dispensaries.
They're going to keep those applications on file for 2 years, 24 months. In case, let's say, one of these dispensary or pot greenhouses, they say something comes up, they do something illegal, and their licenses are revoked, then you have a ready file of applications that you can go to and say, okay, here's the next in line, and let's let them have a chance at this opportunity.
All right, well, with that, we'll wrap it up. I'm Michael Heblin. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.
Local broadcast of Arkansas Week is made possible in part by the award-winning Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, Arkansas's largest major newspaper, bringing you local, national, and international news since 1819. By the Arkansas Times, keeping you informed by covering people, events, and politics in Arkansas. By FM 89, KUAR in Little Rock, with in-depth news reporting, analysis, and discussion each weekday.